Chapter 1. The Hum of a Buried Life. The old diner breathed around Mara Hale. It was a living thing, this place, with a greasy, coffee-scented soul and a heart that hummed with the sound of the ancient refrigerator. She liked the hum. It was steady, predictable. It was everything her life used to be, and everything it wasn't now. She wiped down the counter for the 10th time, the worn red vinyl cool beneath her cloth. The motion was automatic, a prayer in circles. Wipe, rinse, repeat. The rhythm kept the ghosts away, most of the time. A trucker named Gus sat in the corner booth, nursing a mug of black coffee. He was a kind man with eyes that had seen too many miles of empty highway. He never asked about the sadness that clung to her like the smell of fried bacon. He just grunted a thank you and left a folded $5 bill under his saucer. That was the kind of connection Mara could handle. Simple, clean, no strings attached. Because strings always turned into chains, and she'd spent a lifetime chewing through hers. She wanted this quiet life, this small, controlled world, because freedom tasted a lot like loneliness, and she had learned to call it peace. Outside, the sky was turning the color of a nasty bruise. Thunder grumbled in the distance, a low growl that vibrated through the soles of her worn sneakers. Storms out here on the edge of the forest were different. They weren't just weather. They were an event. The wind began to whisper through the pines, a sound like 1,000 secrets being told at once. Mara topped off the sugar dispensers, her movements precise. Orderly. The world outside could be chaos, but in here she was the god of salt shakers and napkin holders. It was a small kingdom, but it was hers. This quiet existence was a fortress she'd built brick by boring brick. Each sunrise, each order of pancakes, each polished spoon was another stone in the wall. A wall to keep the past out. A past of pack law, of moon-sworn oaths, of a love that had betrayed her so completely it had ripped her own wildness from her. She didn't miss the wolf. Not really. She missed the silence in her own head, a silence she could only find here, in the hum of the fridge and the clink of ceramic on Formica. The life she'd escaped was a story told in another language, one she'd forced herself to forget. Then it happened. Beyond the rumble of the coming storm, another sound cut through the air. High and wild, and so achingly familiar it made her breath catch in her throat. A howl. Not a dog. Not a coyote. It was the call of the deep woods, a mournful, lonely cry that spoke of moons and blood and belonging. Her hand froze over the counter, the rag slipping from her numb fingers. A tremor ran through her, a phantom echo of something that once lived inside her skin. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. The sound was a key turning in a lock she'd sworn was rusted shut. The wild world wasn't just calling. It was calling her name, and it was getting closer. Chapter 2. The Rider and the Storm. Following the haunting cry, the storm broke its chains. Rain didn't just fall. It attacked, throwing itself against the diner's big plate glass windows in sheets. The world outside dissolved into a gray, watery blur. Mara stood frozen for a long moment, the echo of that howl still ringing in her ears. She forced herself to move, to bend down and pick up the fallen rag. It's just an animal, she told herself, her mind fighting a war against her own blood. An animal lost in the woods. Nothing to do with you. Nothing at all. Because if it did have something to do with her, her entire fragile peace would shatter like glass. She started her closing routine, the familiar tasks a shield against the rising anxiety. She flipped the sign on the door from open to closed, the click of the lock a satisfying sound of finality. But the storm outside seemed to mock her attempts at control. The wind howled louder now, a symphony with the thunder. It was then that a new sound joined the chorus, a desperate, mechanical roar. It was an engine, a powerful one, but it was straining, fighting the wind and the slick asphalt. She peered through the rain-streaked window, her brow furrowed. No one should be out on the highway in this mess. A single headlight cut a wobbly path through the darkness. It was a motorcycle, a big, dark machine with a lone rider hunched over the handlebars, a shadow against the fury of the storm. Even from a distance, she could sense the rider's exhaustion, the way the bike swerved unsteadily. He wasn't just riding through the storm, he was running from it, or from something else that chased him through the rain. Her hand rested on the phone, her finger hovering over the numbers for Sheriff Brody. But what would she say? That a man was driving too fast in the rain? He'd think she was crazy. She watched, unable to look away, as the headlight grew brighter, closer. The bike seemed to falter, the engine sputtering a painful, metallic cough. The rider fought to control it, his body a tense line of resistance against the machine and the weather. Why didn't he stop? Why was he pushing so hard? There was a recklessness to him, a self-destructive energy that felt like a lit match in a room full of gasoline. It was a feeling she recognized. It was the feeling of having no other choice. Suddenly, the world exploded in light and noise. The bike's back tire hit a patch of slick oil or wet leaves. It went sideways. The roar of the engine became a high-pitched scream of tortured metal. The lone headlight spun wildly, a frantic spotlight searching for something to hold onto in the chaos. For one terrifying, heart-stopping second, the beam flooded the diner, pinning Mara in its glare. It was like being caught in the eye of a predator. Then, with a sickening crunch that seemed to shake the very foundations of her diner, the light, the bike, and the rider crashed into the ancient oak tree at the edge of her parking lot. And then, silence. A terrible, heavy quiet, broken only by the drumming of the rain. Chapter 3. The Name. She tried to forget. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of rain and the frantic thumping in her own chest. The crash had been so final, so absolute. A part of her, the part that had built the walls, screamed at her to stay inside. Lock the door. Pretend it never happened. It's not your problem. It's not your world. Not anymore. Because trouble was a magnet, and she'd spent the last 5 years demagnetizing her soul. But the other part of her, the healer she could never quite kill, was already moving. Her hand fumbled with the deadbolt. The door flew open, snatched by the wind, and slammed against the outside wall. The storm rushed in, cold and wet, whipping her hair across her face. The air was thick with the smell of rain-soaked earth, of hot spilled gasoline, and something else. Something primal and dark that coiled in her gut. Blood. And wolf. The scent hit her not as a smell, but as a memory. A jolt of electricity that shot up her spine and made the hair on her arms stand on end. Oh gods, no, not here. She ran, her sneakers slipping on the wet asphalt. The motorcycle was a twisted wreck of chrome and steel wrapped around the thick trunk of the oak tree, and lying a few feet away, thrown from the impact, was the rider. He was a heap of black leather and denim, unnervingly still. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering, uncertain. "Hey!" she called out, her voice thin against the wind. "Hey, can you hear me?" There was no answer. With trembling fingers, she reached for his helmet, fumbling with the strap. She pulled it off, and her breath hitched. He was young, maybe her age, with a strong jawline covered in dark stubble. His black hair was plastered to his forehead with rain and blood. A nasty gash above his eyebrow was weeping red. He was broken. So broken. And yet, beneath the pain etched on his face, there was a strange familiarity, a sense of knowing. Had she seen him before? But then his eyes fluttered open. They weren't focused. They were a stunning molten gold, glazed with pain, and they were looking right through her. His lips parted, a rough, broken sound escaping, a whisper, a single word that shattered her carefully constructed world into a million pieces. "Mara." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a breath of relief, like he'd crossed oceans of time and pain just to say it. And then his eyes rolled back in his head, and his body went limp, his head lolling to the side. Disbelief warred with a terrifying, rising panic. How? How could this stranger know her name? A name she hadn't used since she'd left her old life in ashes. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, faint, thready, fading fast. Thump. Thump. And as his heartbeat faltered beneath her fingertips, something deep inside her answered. A low, sleepy growl rumbled in the base of her soul. A warmth spread through her veins, a forgotten power stirring from its long slumber. For the first time in 5 years, her wolf was waking up. Chapter 4. The Crescent Fang. Getting him inside was a nightmare. He was a dead weight of unconscious muscle and wet leather, and the storm fought her every step of the way. Mara grunted, half dragging, half carrying him through the diner door. His arms slung over her shoulder, his head lolled against her neck, and the intimate contact sent another shiver of that strange, unwelcome recognition through her. She slammed the door shut against the wailing wind, the lock clicking home with a sound of grim finality. The world was now outside. The danger was in. She wrestled him into the nearest booth, his long legs tangling with the table pedestal. The red vinyl groaned under his weight, a sound of protest she felt deep in her bones. For a moment, she just stood there, breathing heavily, rain and sweat dripping down her face. The scent of him, pine and storm and something wilder, filled the small space, pushing out the familiar smell of coffee and bleach. It was an invasion. He was an invasion. But the healer in her, the part she could never fully silence, took over. The gash on his head was bad, and who knew what other injuries he had. With a sigh that felt like it was pulled from the depths of her soul, she grabbed the diner's big first aid kit from under the counter. She had to stop the bleeding. Because that's what she did. She fixed things. She worked with a detached efficiency, cutting away the sleeve of his torn, impossibly soft leather jacket. It felt ancient, worn with stories. As she sliced through the fabric of his black t-shirt beneath, her scissors snagged on something. Annoyed, she pulled the shredded cloth aside to get a better look. And then she saw it. And the entire world stopped spinning. There, on the hard curve of his bicep, was a mark she knew as well as her own reflection. A crescent moon, inked in black, with the sharp, cruel silhouette of a single wolf's fang piercing it from above. The crescent fang mark. The sigil of her old pack. The sigil of the family that had ruled it. The sigil of the man who had broken her. The first aid kit slipped from her lap and crashed to the floor, scattering rolls of gauze and antiseptic wipes across the checkered linoleum. The air left her lungs in a rush. Shock, cold and sharp, stabbed through her. It was followed by a wave of heat, a rage so pure and so potent it made her vision swim red at the edges. One of them, here, in her diner, in her sanctuary. The sheer, impossible audacity of it stole her breath. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms. Every instinct screamed at her to finish the job the crash had started, drag him back out into the storm. Let the forest take him. Let his own kind find what was left. It would be justice. Yet, as she stared at the hated mark on his skin, a different current pulled at her. A strange, deep thrumming in her blood, a vibration that seemed to connect her to him. It was a pull, an invisible thread that tightened in her chest, refusing to let the rage consume her completely. It made no sense. This man, this enemy, should be the easiest person in the world to hate. So why did the thought of leaving him to die feel like tearing out a piece of herself? As she wrestled with the hurricane of her own emotions, his eyelids fluttered. He groaned, a low sound of pure agony. His eyes opened, no longer hazy, but a sharp, burning gold that seemed to look right into her soul. He took a ragged breath and his gaze softened with a look of profound wonder. He whispered, his voice a rough rasp, "You smell like home." Chapter 5. A scent like home. Mara flinched back as if he'd struck her. The words, so soft and full of awe, were a bigger shock than the crash itself. Home? She repeated, her own voice sharp and brittle, a weapon to keep him at a distance. Don't you dare talk to me about home. She scrambled to her feet, putting the width of the table between them. Her heart was a trapped bird, beating frantically against the cage of her ribs. The rage was still there, a hot coal in her gut, but now it was mixed with a terrifying confusion. Nothing about this made sense. He struggled to push himself up, hissing in pain as his injuries protested. His golden eyes, impossibly bright in the dim diner light, never left her. They were filled with questions, with a deep, aching sincerity that she refused to believe. I don't understand, he rasped, one hand coming up to press against his bleeding head. I know you. I know this place. He looked around the diner, a flicker of recognition in his gaze. I've dreamed of it, of you, for months. This was worse than just knowing her name. This was fate, a concept she had long ago dismissed as a pretty lie Pax told to justify their cruelties. Stop it, she snapped, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. I don't know who you are, but I know what that mark on your arm means. You're one of them. She couldn't bring herself to say the name Draven. It was ash in her mouth. How did you find me? Who sent you? She demanded, the questions tumbling out. She needed answers. She needed a reason, because a reason could be fought. This strange, dream-spun connection could not. He just shook his head, a pained and helpless gesture. No one sent me. I was running. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to find you. She wanted to scream at him, to call him a liar, but his eyes held no deceit. Only a profound, soul-deep exhaustion and that same unnerving awe as he looked at her. The air between them grew thick, charged with an energy that was both terrifying and magnetic. She could feel it on her skin, a hum of awareness that made her feel more alive than she had in years. She hated it. She hated him for making her feel it, but her body betrayed her. Her wolf, newly awakened, was curious. It recognized something in him. A resonance. A match. She fought the feeling down with practiced ease. Against her better judgment, she moved back towards him, grabbing a clean cloth from the counter. You're bleeding all over my booth, she muttered, the practical complaint a flimsy shield for the turmoil inside her. As she reached out to press the cloth to the gash on his forehead, her fingers brushed against his temple. A jolt, sharp and white-hot, like a lightning strike, shot up her arm. It was pure energy, a static pulse that lit up every nerve ending in her body. He gasped, pulling back as if he'd been burned, his golden eyes wide with shock. She snatched her hand away, staring at her own trembling fingers. That was not a coincidence. That was not a dream. It was something real, something powerful, and something she was terrifyingly, hopelessly tangled in. Chapter 6. The Devil at the Door. The echo of that electric touch hung in the air between them, a silent, crackling testament to the fact that their worlds had just collided. Neither of them spoke. They just stared, caught in a moment of shared shock and disbelief. Mara's carefully ordered universe had been thrown into complete chaos. First the howl, then the crash, then the name, the mark, and now this undeniable, terrifying connection. Before either of them could find the words to dissect the impossible, a new sound cut through the storm, the crunch of tires on wet gravel. Mara's head snapped toward the window. Two bright headlights sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the diner's interior before coming to a stop. Her blood went cold. That wasn't a police car. It was a big, black pickup truck, the kind that was built to dominate the road, its engine a low, predatory rumble. Panic, sharp and cold, seized her. They couldn't have tracked him this fast, could they? Who is that? She breathed, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. Hale, the stranger with the familiar soul, tried to push himself up, His gaze locked on the truck. "They found me," he said, his voice grim. There was no question who they were. In that instant, Mara was standing on a knife's edge. A choice, clear and terrible, presented itself. She could open the door. She could point to the wounded man in her booth and wash her hands of it all. Give the crescent fang wolf to his pursuers. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. It would be giving them exactly what they wanted and getting them out of her life, out of her diner, forever. It was the perfect, logical solution. Her old life had taught her that loyalty was a weapon, and this man was on the wrong side of the war she'd fought so hard to escape. But then she looked at him. He was trying to get to his feet, trying to stand and fight despite being barely able to hold his head up. There was no surrender in his golden eyes, only a fierce, cornered defiance. And in that moment, he wasn't a symbol of a hated pack. He wasn't a draven. He was just a man, wounded and hunted, who had whispered her name like a prayer. And the part of her that was a healer, the part of her that was a wolf, the part of her that was still, somewhere deep down, a woman. It refused to let him be taken. "Get in the back," she hissed, the decision made in a split second of pure, illogical instinct. "Now!" She grabbed his arm, pulling him out of the booth. He stumbled, leaning heavily on her. A loud, impatient knock hammered on the front door. Bang, bang, bang. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. "The storeroom. Don't make a sound," she ordered, shoving him towards the swinging door that led to the kitchen. She pushed him into the darkness, surrounded by sacks of flour and potatoes, and pulled the door shut just as another series of thunderous knocks rattled the diner. She leaned against the storeroom door, her whole body trembling, and took a deep breath. She had to lie. She had to be convincing. She had just hidden the son of her greatest enemy. After a moment, she opened the front door, a look of tired annoyance on her face. When the hunters finally left, empty-handed and angry, she sagged against the frame, the lie a sour taste in her mouth. She had crossed a line. There was no going back. She slowly opened the storeroom door. Kyle was leaning against a stack of canned peaches, watching her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He pushed himself upright, his gaze intense. "You just changed both our fates," he murmured, and the weight of his words settled over her, as heavy and real as the storm still raging outside. Chapter 7. The Quiet Between Storms. The days that followed were strange. They settled into a quiet, unspoken routine, a fragile truce born from shared danger. A world of silence existed between them, filled with the things they refused to say. Hale's body healed with the unnatural speed of his kind, but he moved with a careful purpose, as if afraid of breaking the delicate peace inside the diner's four walls. He insisted on helping. He would sweep the floors in the morning, his movements still stiff or stacked clean, heavy plates with a focused grace that seemed out of place in the greasy spoon. They were simple tasks, domestic and mundane, but in the thick silence, they became a conversation. Each small act of service was a question, each quiet acceptance from her an answer. Mara watched him from behind the counter, her arms crossed, a permanent knot of suspicion in her stomach. She kept reminding herself what he was. A crescent fang, a draven, the living symbol of a past she had nearly died to escape. Yet, her eyes betrayed her. She saw the way the early morning light caught the gold in his irises. She noticed the deep exhaustion that never quite left his face even when he slept. He was a threat to her safety, a danger to her solitude, a walking, breathing ghost from a life she wanted to remain buried. But the more she watched him, the less he looked like a monster and the more he just looked lost. Their little bubble was occasionally disturbed by the rumble of a passing truck or the arrival of a lone customer. When the bell over the door would jingle, Hale would disappear into the storeroom without a word, a silent ghost in her small kingdom. They existed together in this strange limbo, a pocket of stillness between the storm that had brought him here and the one that was surely coming to find him. It was an uneasy calm, and Mara found herself fighting a warmth that was beginning to bloom in her chest. It felt like comfort. It felt like trust. And those were the two most dangerous feelings she knew, because she'd learned the hard way that comfort was just the pleasant lull before the trap springs shut. She felt a strange sense of safety with him, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in 5 long years. It was absurd. He was the most dangerous thing to ever walk through her door, and yet the rhythmic sound of his breathing from the booth where he slept was more soothing than the familiar hum of the refrigerator. She was a survivor, and survivors knew that letting your guard down was a fatal mistake. The fortress she had built around her heart was beginning to show cracks, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he was the one holding the hammer. One night, sleep refused to come. The silence in her small apartment above the diner was too loud. She crept down the stairs, the old wood groaning under her feet. She expected to find him awake, staring out the window, but he was asleep in the corner booth, his head resting on his arms. He was murmuring something, his voice thick with sleep. She moved closer, her own breathing shallow. It was her name. Mara. He said it not with the surprise of a new acquaintance, but with the deep, tired sigh of a man who had been saying it his whole life. It was a sound filled with an ancient, unbearable sorrow, as if he wasn't just dreaming of her, but remembering her from another lifetime. Chapter 8. Scars That Bloom. The sound of her name on his sleeping lips echoed in the quiet diner long after the whisper faded. It was the final crack in her resolve. She could no longer live in the silence, pretending he was just a wounded traveler. He was a puzzle she didn't want to solve, but his pieces were scattered all over her floor. The next evening, after the last customer had gone and the closed sign was turned, she found him staring out the window at the dark, looming forest. The fragile peace had become a heavy tension. She needed to break it. "You have to tell me why they're hunting you," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. "Not the lies you tell yourself, Hale. The truth." He turned from the window, and in the dim glow of the neon sign, she saw the deep pain in his golden eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing. He just looked at her, his gaze so intense it felt like he could see every wall she'd ever built. "It's better if you don't know," he finally said, his voice low and rough. "The Draven family, we have a lot of enemies." Mara let out a short, bitter laugh. "The great Draven alphas. I've heard the stories. Your line is blessed by the moon goddess, powerful, unbeatable." Her words were laced with the bitterness of old pack rivalries, of stories told to frighten pups. He flinched as if she'd slapped him. "That's the lie we tell the world," he said, his voice dropping even lower, filled with a shame that was centuries old. "The power isn't a blessing, Mara. It's a curse." He took a hesitant step closer, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Every alpha in my line is born with it," he explained, the words seeming to tear at him as they came out. "The closer I allow myself to get to someone, the more I feel for them, the sicker they become. And if I fall in love—" He choked on the word, unable to finish. He didn't have to. She understood. The ultimate cruelty for a creature of pack and mate bonds, to be lethal to the ones you cherish most. She wanted to dismiss it as a dark fairy tale, a convenient excuse. But the raw agony on his face was too real. Seeing the disbelief in her eyes, he acted. "Let me show you." With a grimace, he pulled the hem of his t-shirt up, exposing the skin over his ribs. Mara's breath caught. It wasn't the toned muscle or the old, faded battle scars that shocked her. It was the other marks. Thin, dark lines snaked across his skin like blackened veins, branching out into strange, ugly patterns that looked like wilted flowers. They were scars, but not from any weapon she had ever seen. "What are they?" she whispered, horrified. "They appear when I feel something," he said, his voice flat and dead. "A moment of friendship, a surge of loyalty, even a spark of affection. Each one is a warning, a reminder of what I am. Her anger, her suspicion, it all just dissolved. It evaporated in the face of his quiet torment. All she saw was a man living in a cage made of his own heart. A monster and a victim, all at once. Without thinking, her hand lifted, her healer's instincts overriding everything else. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the edge of one of the dark floral scars. His skin was warm, human. He flinched at her touch but didn't pull away. In that moment, he wasn't a draven. He was just Hale. And her hardened heart broke for him. He saw the shift in her eyes, the dangerous bloom of empathy. His expression turned to one of desperate alarm. "This is why I have to leave," he said, his voice urgent. "I came looking for you because a prophecy said you could break it. But now I see. I was wrong. I can't stay here." He looked directly into her eyes, his own filled with a terrible, stark warning. "Because if I fall for you, Mara, you'll die." Chapter 9. An old ghost, a new demon. His words hung between them, a death sentence delivered in a whisper. "You'll die." The diner, her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a tomb. For 2 days they moved around each other like ghosts, the terrible confession a wall of glass separating them. The quiet was no longer comfortable, it was heavy with unspoken fear and a forbidden growing desire. The curse gave a name to the crackling energy between them, and knowing it was lethal only seemed to make it stronger. Then on the 3rd day, the past didn't just knock, it kicked the door down. He walked in as the sun was setting, casting a long, arrogant shadow across the floor. The little bell over the door chimed, a cheerful sound for a devil's arrival. Mara looked up from the grill and her stomach plummeted to the floor. Liam, her ex-mate. He looked the same handsome, cruel face, the same easy smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Mara, Mara, Mara," he said, his voice a smooth, mocking purr. He strolled to the counter, looking around with disdain. "Hiding out in this greasy spoon. I almost didn't believe the rumors. The pack's great healer slinging hash for truckers. How far you've fallen." "What do you want, Liam?" she asked, her voice tight. She grabbed a heavy skillet, her knuckles white. "I heard you had a visitor," he continued, ignoring her question. He leaned in, his voice dropping. "A stray dog, one with a very particular family history. I told you I'd always find you." The back door creaked open. Hale stepped out of the storeroom, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes landed on Liam, and he froze. The air in the diner turned electric, the pressure dropping like it did before a lightning strike. Liam's smile widened, a flash of white teeth. It was a predator's grin. "Well, well," he drawled, his gaze sweeping over Hale with contempt. "If it isn't Draven's cursed son, the walking plague. My Mara, you always did have a taste for damaged things." The insult was aimed at Hale, but the venom was for her. Liam took a step toward her, his hand reaching out to grab her arm. "You're coming home. You're still mine, by pack law." That was the trigger. Hale moved. He wasn't human anymore. He crossed the room in a blur of motion too fast for the eye to follow. A low, guttural growl ripped from his chest, a sound so primal it vibrated through the floorboards. His eyes were blazing gold, the pupils blown wide with pure, undiluted fury. He slammed into Liam, shoving him back against the jukebox with enough force to crack the glass. "Don't," he snarled, the word more animal than man. "Touch her." The fight was brutal and quick. It exploded out the front door and into the twilight of the parking lot. Liam shifted halfway, his features elongating, claws sprouting from his fingertips. But Hale didn't. He fought as a man, filled with the strength and fury of the wolf. It was a storm of fists and snarls. Hale took a deep gash on his arm, but he gave back twice as much, moving with a savage grace that was terrifying and beautiful. He fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Finally, With a sickening crunch, Hale landed a punch that sent Liam sprawling to the gravel. Defeated and bleeding, Liam scrambled back to his truck, his eyes promising murder. "The pack will hear about this. They'll hunt you both down like dogs," he screamed before peeling out onto the highway. The threat hung in the air, a promise of blood to come. The secret was out. Their quiet was over. Hale stood panting in the middle of the parking lot, silhouetted against the rising moon, the raw power of his wolf a visible shimmer around him. Mara looked at him, at the blood on his knuckles, spilled for her, and the last of her carefully constructed denial shattered. It was too late. She couldn't pretend not to care anymore. And that realization felt exactly like the beginning of the end. Chapter 10. Whispers in Old Ink. The aftermath of the fight was a cold, ringing silence. Liam was gone, but his threat lingered in the air like the scent of spilled gasoline. "The pack will hunt you both down like dogs." They were exposed. This small, quiet diner was no longer a sanctuary, it was a target. The fragile bubble they had built had been burst, and the real world, with all its teeth and claws, was about to rush in. Hale stood by the door, staring out into the darkness where the truck had disappeared, his posture rigid with a tension that vibrated through the room. The bleeding on his arm had slowed, but a new wound had opened between them, the certainty of what was coming. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at Mara. Her first instinct, the one she had honed for 5 years, was to run, to pack a bag, abandon the diner, and disappear again. But when she looked at Kyle, at the grim set of his jaw and the weary despair in his golden eyes, she knew that running wouldn't work this time. The problem wasn't the pack, it was the curse, and you couldn't run from a thing that was woven into a man's very blood. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was defiance. She was a healer. Healers didn't run from the sickness. They faced it. With a new, thrumming purpose, she went upstairs to her small apartment. Tucked under her bed, covered in a layer of dust, was a heavy cedar-lined chest, a coffin for her old life. She hadn't opened it once in all the years she'd been here, because to open it was to admit that the past was real. Now, her fingers didn't hesitate as she lifted the lid. The scent of old paper, dried wolfsbane, and cedar filled the air, the smell of her family, of her history. She pulled out leather-bound journals filled with the elegant script of her ancestors, generations of pack healers. She was looking for anything, a whisper, a hint, a footnote about a Draven curse. For hours she searched. The diner below was silent, Hale lost in his own grim thoughts. She scanned pages detailing remedies for silver poisoning, rituals for calming a feral wolf, and charts of moon cycles. Nothing. Her hope began to curdle into frustration. Just as she was about to give up, her fingers brushed against a false bottom in the chest. Beneath it lay a single, slender book bound in cracked white leather. It wasn't a healer's journal. It was a book of scripture, filled with prayers to the moon goddess. Tucked between 2 pages was a piece of vellum, folded and brittle with age. The ink was faded, the script archaic. She read the words, her lips moving silently at first, then whispering them aloud into the quiet room. It didn't speak of a curse. It spoke of a tragedy. It told the story of 2 souls, a cursed son from a line of great alphas and a fated healer with the gift of mending, bound together by the goddess's own ancient sorrow. They were destined to find each other, lifetime after lifetime. And each time, their love would bloom, fierce and true. But that love was the trigger. It would awaken the poison in his blood, and he would die, leaving her to grieve until her own time was done. Then, the cycle would begin again. It was an eternal punishment, a love story doomed to repeat its heartbreaking end forever. The strange pull she felt, Hale's impossible dreams, the way he had whispered her name like a memory. It wasn't a beginning. It was a repetition. As she reached the end, the words blurred through her tears, a final, devastating blow. The scripture ended with a chilling, absolute finality. Their love is the poison, their reunion, the wound. Only the final death of one can ever free them both. Chapter 11, A Love Remembered in Scars. The old piece of vellum felt impossibly heavy in her hand, weighted with the history of 100 tragic lifetimes. Mara walked down the stairs, each step a conscious effort, her legs unsteady beneath her. Hale was sitting at the counter, methodically cleaning the gash on his arm from Liam's claws. He didn't look up as she approached, but she knew he felt her presence. The air was thick with their shared dread. She slid the ancient scripture onto the counter in front of him. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. "I found this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It was with my family's things." Kyle glanced at the faded text, his expression dismissive. "Old stories," he grunted, dabbing at his arm with an antiseptic wipe. "Every pack has them. Legends to scare children." His voice was rough, trying so hard to be practical, to deny the strange magic that had crashed into their lives. But Mara wouldn't let him. She couldn't. This was too important. "Read it, Kyle," she insisted, pushing the vellum closer. Her hand was shaking. He finally looked at her, saw the desperate terror in her eyes, and sighed. He picked it up. As he read, his cynical facade began to crumble. She watched his golden eyes scan the archaic script, his brow furrowing. His breath hitched. The words on the page, the ancient cadence of the prophecy, were acting like a key, unlocking a door in his mind that had been sealed for centuries. Suddenly, he dropped the scripture as if it had burned him. He clutched his head, a pained groan escaping his lips. "What is it?" Mara cried, rushing to his side. "What do you see?" His eyes had lost focus, staring at something far away, something only he could see. "A field," he gasped, his voice strained. "It's on fire! The sky is full of smoke." His breathing grew frantic, his body trembling with the force of the vision. "I see. You're there." He turned his unfocused gaze on her, but he was seeing a different face, a different lifetime. "You're crying." His voice broke, filled with an ancient memory of pain. "And me," he whispered, his eyes wide with a horrifying, dawning recognition. "I'm on the ground. I'm dying. I can feel the life leaving me." He looked down at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "But I'm not scared." A single tear traced a path down his cheek. "I'm looking up at you, and all I can feel is relief. I'm happy." His voice was choked with a sorrow so profound it felt like it could swallow the world. "Because I found you again, even if it was just for a little while." The vision faded, leaving him gasping, the diner swimming back into focus. He stared at her, and in that moment she didn't see a stranger she'd met a few days ago. She saw the man from his memory. She saw the truth of 100 lifetimes of love and loss reflected in his haunted golden eyes. The prophecy wasn't a story. It was their story. The pull, the dreams, the impossible connection. It was all real. And it was all a curse. Their love wasn't just doomed in this life. It had been doomed in every life before. A wave of terror and a contradictory, powerful surge of longing washed over her. They were not just a boy and a girl in a lonely diner. They were cosmic figures, trapped in a divine tragedy. Finally, understanding the sheer, impossible scale of what they were to each other, Mara looked at the man she had loved and lost 1,000 times before, and whispered the terrible, eternal truth. "Then this is how it always ends." Chapter 12. The Taste of Prophecy. The revelation settled over them, a suffocating shroud of destiny. They were trapped. Not by Liam, not by any pack, but by fate itself. Every glance was now loaded with the weight of forgotten lifetimes, every accidental touch a reminder of the poison that flowed between them. They were two magnets forced together, knowing the connection would cause a world-shattering explosion. The air in the diner grew so thick with unspoken feelings it was hard to breathe. They avoided each other, creating vast distances in the small space, terrified that a single word or look would set the prophecy in motion. As if sensing their internal turmoil, the sky outside darkened once more. The storm that had brought Hale to her doorstep had either returned or sent its angrier brother in its place. Wind howled around the diner's corners, and rain began to beat against the windows like frantic fists. A deafening crack of thunder shook the entire building, and with a fizzle and a pop, the lights went out. Darkness, sudden and absolute, swallowed them whole. Mara gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. The only light was the intermittent, ghostly flash of lightning, freezing them in stark, terrifying tableaus. The darkness, combined with the crushing weight of their fate, was too much. It snapped. "You should have stayed away," Mara heard herself yell, her voice shrill with fear and despair. A flash of lightning illuminated Kyle's face across the room, his expression a mask of anguish. "You think I had a choice?" he roared back, his voice booming like the thunder outside. "Every dream, every instinct, my entire life has been pulling me here, pulling me to you." They were shouting now, not at each other, but at the cruel, invisible cage that had been built around them. It was a fight against the gods, against the ink on a forgotten piece of vellum. Their angry, desperate words drew them closer in the dark. Another flash of lightning, and he was right in front of her. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the scent of rain and his own unique wild musk. "This isn't fair," she whispered, her anger dissolving into a sob. "It's not," he agreed, his voice thick with a sorrow that matched her own. In that charged, impossible moment, she didn't care about curses or prophecies. She didn't care about dying. She only cared about the soul-deep ache to feel something, anything, other than this crushing hopelessness. She surged forward, her hands grabbing the front of his shirt, and pulled his mouth down to hers. The kiss was not gentle, it was a desperate, frantic collision. It was a rebellion, a furious scream against their destiny. It tasted of rain and the salt of her tears, and a deep, coppery hint of blood and fate. For one perfect, terrible second, there was no curse, only them. Only this. He kissed her back with a hunger that spoke of centuries of longing, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her tight against him as if he could weld them together and keep the world at bay. Then he ripped his mouth from hers with a sharp, ragged gasp of pain. He stumbled back, clutching his arm. Lightning flashed again, brilliantly, and Mara saw it. The half-healed gash from Liam's claws had torn wide open, blood welling up, dark and thick. But it was worse than that. The strange, flower-like scars on his skin were glowing with a faint, sickly light, pulsing like angry veins. Their one act of love, their single moment of defiance, had been the trigger. The prophecy was real. It was happening now. He was bleeding in her arms as thunder crashed around them, the sound of their doom finally beginning. Chapter 13. Into the Woods. The kiss had been a lit match, and the prophecy was the gasoline. In the flashing, violent light of the storm, Mara stared at the blood welling from Hale's arm, a direct result of their forbidden touch. The curse wasn't a story. It was a physical, bleeding truth. There was no more time for denial, no more room for hesitation. The real world was coming for them. Kyle instinctively tried to push her away, his face a mask of self-loathing and panic. "See?" he gasped, the word torn from him. "This is what I do. You have to get away from me, Mara. Run!" But something inside her had irrevocably shifted. The woman who had spent 5 years running was gone, replaced by a defiant healer who had finally found a wound worth fighting. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm as she grabbed a clean towel to press against his arm. "We're in this together. There is no more running." Before he could argue, the sound of spitting gravel and rumbling engines filled the night. Headlights, not one pair but two, flooded the diner, turning the rain-streaked windows into glaring white eyes. A heavy boot kicked the front door, splintering the frame and sending it flying inward. Liam strode in, his face a snarl of triumph, flanked by 2 other shifters from her old pack. Their eyes were glowing with a hungry, predatory light. They were here to finish the job. Chaos erupted. Hale shoved Mara behind him, his weakened body a fragile shield. "Get out the back!" he yelled, his voice a commander's roar that seemed out of place in the small diner. The shifters lunged. The fight was a blur of motion and violence. Mara, acting on pure instinct, grabbed the pot of day-old coffee from the warmer and hurled the hot black liquid into the face of one of the attackers. He howled in pain and surprise. Hale used the opening, slamming another man into the counter with a grunt of effort. But he was fading. She could see the curse taking its toll, the dark scars on his skin pulsing with a sickly energy. They couldn't win. They could only flee. She grabbed Hale's hand, pulling him toward the kitchen. "This way!" she screamed. They crashed through the swinging doors, out the back exit, and into the cold, unforgiving embrace of the forest. The world she had abandoned for 5 years now became her only hope for survival. They ran, crashing through the undergrowth, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them, angry shouts, snapping branches, and the low, terrifying growls of wolves on the hunt. The forest was a labyrinth of black trees and grasping thorns. Rain plastered Mara's hair to her face, her lungs burning with every ragged breath. Just when her legs were about to give out, a shape loomed in the darkness, an old abandoned hunter's cabin half swallowed by vines. It was a memory from her childhood, a place she hadn't thought of in years. "In here," she gasped, pulling Hale toward the dilapidated structure. They practically fell through the rotting door, slamming it shut and collapsing against it, their bodies trembling. They were soaked, shivering, and running on nothing but raw adrenaline and fear. Outside, the howls of Liam's hunters echoed through the woods, closer than she liked. They were trapped in the small one-room cabin, the suffocating proximity amplifying every ragged breath, every unspoken thought. The terror of the hunt, the forbidden heat of their kiss, and the sheer desperate exhaustion combined, creating a volatile, explosive pressure in the darkness. There was nowhere left to run, either from the hunters or from the undeniable, lethal thing that was growing between them. Chapter 14. The Prophecy and the Lie. The storm outside mirrored the one inside the tiny cabin. They were pressed together in the dark, the scent of rain, damp earth, and their own fear thick in the air. The adrenaline from the chase slowly faded, leaving behind a raw, trembling vulnerability. In the aftermath of the violence and the flight, a different kind of intensity took over. It was the desperate, unspoken need of 2 people who had nothing left in the world but each other. Words were useless. Apologies were pointless. With the howls of their hunters as their witness, they came together in a storm of their own, a collision of passion and despair that was as inevitable as it was forbidden. Afterward, in the fragile quiet, they lay tangled in the darkness. For one brief, stolen moment, there was no curse, no hunt, no prophecy. There was only the solid warmth of his body next to hers, the steady rhythm of his heart against her back. It was a peace so profound it terrified her. This, she thought, was the feeling that had ruined her once before. This was the trap. Hale stirred behind her, his lips brushing against her hair. "Mara," he whispered, his voice thick with a new, heavier emotion. "I have to tell you everything. The truth." She tensed, a cold premonition snaking around her heart. "The truth about what?" she asked, afraid of the answer. He took a deep breath. "My dreams, they weren't just dreams. It didn't start as fate. It started as a mission." He explained that he'd spent years chasing rumors, seeking out seers and wise women, desperate for a cure. He'd heard whispers of a prophecy, a different one, that said the last healer of the Hale line held the ancient magic needed to sever the Draven curse. He hadn't just stumbled upon her diner by accident. He had been searching for her. Intentionally. The fragile peace shattered. The warmth in her chest turned to ice. Every tender moment, every vulnerable look, every shared secret replayed in her mind. now tainted with a new ugly meaning. He hadn't been drawn to her. He had been hunting for a key, a tool, a cure. The familiar, sickening acid of betrayal rose in her throat. It was Liam, all over again. Liam, who had praised her healing gifts and whispered words of love, only to use her power to secure his own position in the pack. The pattern was identical. The wound, her deepest and most defining wound, was ripped open once more. "So you came here to use me," she said, her voice flat and dead. She pulled away from him, scrambling to the other side of the small cabin. The space was suddenly a suffocating cage. "It started that way," he said, his voice pleading as he sat up. "I swear, Mara, it started that way, but it changed. The moment I saw you, everything changed. What I feel is real." But she couldn't hear him. The roaring in her ears was the sound of her own heart breaking again. All she could hear was the echo of another man's lies. "I don't believe you," she choked out, tears of fury and pain streaming down her face. She had let her guard down. She had been a fool. Again. Driven by a pain so sharp it felt like a physical blow, she did the only thing she knew how to do. She ran. Shoving past his outstretched hand, she threw open the cabin door and bolted into the pre-dawn gloom, not caring where she was going, only needing to escape the crushing weight of history repeating itself. She burst through a thicket of ferns, running blindly, and slammed directly into a hard chest. Strong hands grabbed her arms. She looked up, her vision blurred by tears, into the triumphant, cruel face of Liam. Chapter 15. The Nature of the Cage. Liam's grip was like iron on her arms. His hunters emerged from the trees, surrounding her in a silent, menacing circle. The triumphant smirk on his face was the most hateful thing she had ever seen. The despair from Kyle's betrayal morphed into a new, cold horror. She had run from one cage straight into another. "Let me go," she snarled, struggling against him, but it was useless. He was stronger, and she was emotionally and physically spent. "Let you go?" Liam chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Oh, Mara, I'm never letting you go again. You're far too valuable." He tightened his grip, pulling her closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You see, I've been doing my own research since I last saw you. I know all about your pet project. The Draven curse, the fated healer. It's a tragic little love story, isn't it?" His words were laced with a venomous glee that made her skin crawl. This was worse than a simple desire for revenge. This was calculated. "You think killing him will make you an alpha?" She spat, trying to sound brave. "You're a coward, Liam." His smile widened. "Kill him?" he asked, as if the idea were absurd. "Why would I destroy the most powerful weapon a wolf has seen in 1,000 years? No, I'm not going to kill him. I'm going to aim him." The meaning behind his words slowly dawned on her, a horror more profound than any threat of simple violence. "You see," he explained, his eyes glittering with ambition, "his curse is tied to his love for you. As long as I have you, as long as I can hurt you, he'll do anything I say. He'll be my own personal monster, my attack dog. Imagine it. An alpha who can kill his rivals with a single touch, all controlled by me. Every pack on this continent will bend the knee." Her heart stopped. He wasn't just going to use Kale's curse, he was going to use their fated love as the leash. The beautiful, terrible, cosmic connection between them was about to become an instrument of torture and control. In that moment, Mara hit her lowest point. Her desperate flight from a perceived betrayal had delivered her and the key to Kale's enslavement directly into the hands of her enemy. Her own trauma, her inability to trust for even a moment, had forged the chain that would bind Kale. It was her fault. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, leaving her defeated and utterly hopeless. The prophecy was a cage, but she had just handed Liam the key. Just as Liam finished his gloating speech, a twig snapped in the woods behind them. Every head turned. Kyle stepped into the clearing. He wasn't the desperate, pleading man she had run from. He was terrifyingly calm. The anguish was gone, replaced by a chilling, deadly resolve. He took in the scene in an instant. Mara held captive, Liam's triumphant sneer, the circle of hostile wolves. His golden eyes found hers, and in that single, silent look, a universe of understanding passed between them. He saw her capture. She saw his decision. He knew and she knew that for him to fight, for him to unleash the raw, primal power necessary to save her from this, he would have to fully embrace his feelings for her. He would have to stoke the very fire that was the fuel for his own curse. This rescue was not a battle. It was a suicide, and he was going to walk right into it. Chapter 16. A Love That Burns. There was no time for thought, only action. Kyle met the charging wolves not with fear, but with a terrifying, calm fury. He moved with a speed and power that stole Mara's breath, a whirlwind of controlled violence. But as she watched, held fast in the grip of one of Liam's thugs, a sickening horror bloomed in her chest. With every powerful blow Hale landed, the dark, floral scars on his skin seemed to pulse and spread. They crawled up his neck and across his arms like a thorny vine, glowing with a faint, malevolent light. He was fueling his strength with his feelings for her, and the curse was drinking his life force in return. He was literally burning himself out to save her. She saw it all with a terrible, soul-shattering clarity. Her flight from the cabin, her fear of being used. It had all been a lie, she told herself. A ghost story from her past. The truth was happening right here, in blood and desperate action. He wasn't using her. He was dying for her. The love he'd spoken of was not a manipulation. It was a suicidal act of devotion. And in that moment, watching him sacrifice himself piece by piece, she understood her own fatal flaw. She hadn't been betrayed by love. She had been too afraid, too broken by one man's betrayal, to ever truly believe in its power. Her cowardice had led them here. Hale was a magnificent, tragic force of nature. He moved through Liam's pack like a reaper, his every action a testament to his alpha blood. But the cost was staggering. After throwing one wolf into a tree with a sickening crack, he stumbled, catching himself on a knee. A cough rattled his body, and when he looked up, a trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. The light in his golden eyes was beginning to dim, the vibrant fire being slowly choked by the encroaching darkness of the curse. He was winning the battle, but the curse was winning the war. Finally, only Liam remained. He faced Hale, his earlier arrogance replaced by a shocked fury. They clashed, a brutal explosion of snarling, desperate violence. But Liam was fighting for power, Hale was fighting for something more. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Hale drove his fist into Liam's jaw, a blow that echoed through the clearing and sent her ex-mate crumbling to the forest floor in an unconscious heap. It was over. He had won. The moment the fight was done, the power left him all at once. The supernatural strength vanished, leaving only the devastating toll it had taken. He swayed on his feet, his gaze finding Mara's across the clearing. The wolf holding her had long since fled in terror. She ran to him, her feet stumbling over the damp earth. He took one step toward her, then another, before his legs gave out completely. He collapsed, falling to his knees and then pitching forward onto the mossy ground. She slid to a stop beside him, gathering him into her arms. He looked up at her, the last of his energy fading, a faint, heartbreakingly beautiful smile touching his lips. "At least I found you," he whispered, his voice a thread of sound. "This time." Then his golden eyes, once so full of fire, fluttered closed. Chapter 17. A Prayer to a Red Moon. The silence that fell over the clearing was heavier than any sound. It was the quiet of endings, of a battle won at an impossible cost. Liam and his men were gone or unconscious, fading into the shadows of the forest. It was just Mara and Hale, alone with the ghost of the prophecy. She held him, his head cradled in her lap, and felt the life draining out of him. His skin was growing cold, his breathing so shallow it was almost non-existent. The curse, Having consumed his strength was now consuming him completely. All her knowledge, all her training as a healer, was useless against this dark, ancient magic. She was helpless. A raw, animalistic desperation took hold of her. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let him die here. With a surge of adrenaline, she managed to get her arms under him, half lifting, half dragging his limp body into the woods. She had no destination in mind, only a frantic need to escape the scene of his unmaking. But her feet, acting on an instinct older than memory, carried her toward a place she had sworn never to see again. A place of pain and ghosts. She pushed through tangled thorns and ancient trees, her own grief a heavy weight until she stumbled into a clearing. It was the ruins of the old pack's sacred circle. Crumbled stone walls, covered in moss, formed a ring around a flat granite altar stone. This was where healers had come for generations to pray to the moon goddess. It was where she had last seen her mother. The air was thick with memories, with the scent of old magic and forgotten sorrows. It was the heart of the life she had run from. Laying Hale's body gently on the cold, flat surface of the altar, she felt the last of her hope crumble. He was so still, so pale. He was leaving her, and there was nothing she could do. Her strength failed. Her knowledge failed. All that was left was the raw, screaming love in her soul. And so, in her final, desperate moment, she did the one thing she had abandoned years ago. She prayed. Dropping to her knees on the damp earth, she lifted her face to the overcast sky and screamed at the silent, absent goddess who had authored their pain. It wasn't a polite plea. It was a raw, furious, heartbroken bargain. "You did this!" she cried, tears carving paths through the dirt on her cheeks. "You tied us together in this tragedy. Now you have to fix it." She took a shuddering breath, her voice breaking into a sob. "Take it from him. Give it to me." She pressed her hands to her chest, offering herself completely. "Let me take the curse. Let me be the one who dies. I love him. Please, just let him live." It was the ultimate surrender. The woman who had seen love as a cage was now willing to trade her life for it. She understood in this dark night of her soul that love wasn't weakness at all. It was the only power she had left. As her final whispered plea faded into the woods, a strange wind picked up, scattering the leaves around the stone circle. The thick clouds overhead began to part, torn asunder by an unseen hand. Moonlight, stark and sudden, flooded the clearing. But it wasn't the familiar, gentle silver of the moon. It was a deep, terrifying blood red. The goddess had heard her. Chapter 18, The Unmaking. The blood-red moonlight bathed the clearing in an eerie, unnatural glow. It felt ancient and alive, and Mara felt a strange, chilling energy seep into her bones, cold as a river in winter. It was the feeling of a prayer being answered. She stared at Hale's still form on the altar, and with a gasp she saw it happen. The ugly black scars that marred his skin, the physical manifestation of his curse, began to fade. They receded like ink in water, the dark lines shrinking and vanishing, leaving behind pure, unblemished skin. The deathly pallor of his face was replaced by a healthy flush. His chest rose and fell with a deep, steady breath. The curse was being unmade. It was leaving him. At the exact same moment, a sharp, searing pain shot through her own arm. She cried out, looking down at her skin. A thin, black line appeared on her forearm, branching out in a delicate, thorny pattern. A dark flower, identical to the ones that had covered him, was blooming on her own flesh. The curse wasn't gone. It had simply found a new home. The pain intensified, a cold fire spreading through her veins, stealing her breath and her strength. She collapsed to her knees, her body convulsing. She was dying. The agony was immense, but beneath it, a strange sense of peace settled in her heart. She had done it. She had saved him. The endless, tragic cycle was finally broken. As the poison worked its way through her, Hale's eyes fluttered open. He sat up, his movements fluid and strong. He looked at his hands. at his arms, a look of profound disbelief on his face. He was healed. He was free. The joy of it lit his features for a single, brilliant second. Then he saw her. He saw her on the ground, saw the black marks spreading across her skin like a fast-moving blight, saw the agony twisting her face. The joy vanished, replaced by a look of pure, undiluted horror. "Mara!" he cried, his voice breaking. He scrambled off the altar and rushed to her side, gathering her into his arms. "No! What did you do? What did you do?" The beautiful, miraculous freedom he had just been given was now the most terrible torture he could imagine, because it had been bought with her life. Their roles were now completely, cruelly reversed. He was the strong, helpless witness. She was the sacrifice. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her vision was narrowing, the red-lit clearing fading to a gray tunnel. With the last of her strength, she lifted a trembling hand to touch his face, his curse-free skin. "You're free," she managed to whisper. Her hand fell from his cheek, her strength gone. Her heart, which had loved him across 1,000 lifetimes, began to stutter, the beats growing slower, farther apart. The world went dark. As the last flicker of her life was about to be extinguished, he leaned over her, his face a mask of devastation and desperate, furious love. He pressed his lips to hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a fierce, defiant claiming, a denial of the death that was stealing her away. Chapter 19. The echo of a howl darkness. A deep, silent, and endless void. Mara felt herself floating in it, untethered from her body, from her life, from her pain. This must be death, she thought with a strange, distant calm, a quiet, final peace. But then a warmth bloomed in the nothingness, a single point of light and heat in the vast, cold emptiness. It was his kiss. It wasn't just the touch of his lips. It was the desperate, frantic press of his soul against hers, an anchor refusing to let her drift away into the abyss. Through that connection she could feel him, not his thoughts, not in words, but in waves of pure, undiluted emotion. Grief, so powerful it was a physical force. Horror at what she had done. And then, a sudden, sharp clarity. A decision. From her place in the void, she felt him pull away. He was looking at her. She knew it. He was looking at the blood moon, at his own hands, now clean of the curse that had defined his entire existence. And he understood. The goddess hadn't offered a simple trade. She had presented the final piece of the puzzle. The prophecy was not a lie. Only the final death of one can free them both. He had thought it meant one of their lives, a cruel choice between two lovers, but now, linked to her at the very edge of death, he saw the other meaning. Not the death of the man, but the death of the wolf. It was a truth so terrible and so perfect it must have felt like a divine revelation. To unravel the dark magic of the curse, he had to sacrifice the source of his power, the other half of his soul. He had to kill his own wolf. To save her, he had to become a broken thing in the eyes of his people, a shifter without a shift, a man without his wildness, a fate many considered worse than any death. It was the ultimate price, a sacrifice of his very identity. She felt his decision not as a thought, but as a wave of love so immense, so pure and selfless. It was like a sunrise in the darkness. It was the force that stopped her drift. It was the anchor that began to pull her, slowly, painstakingly, back toward the distant shore of life. The connection between them was no longer a curse. It was a lifeline. He had made his choice. He would unmake himself to make her whole again. He leaned close to her still, silent form on the altar. She couldn't hear him with her ears, but his voice echoed in the void where her soul was floating, a low, determined promise that resonated through her entire being. "I'm coming back for you, Mara," he whispered, a vow made against fate itself. "Wait for me." She felt him stand, felt him turn his back on her still body. He was facing the woods, facing the enemy, facing the terrible, beautiful sacrifice he was about to make. And in the darkness, she waited. Chapter 20. The unbecoming Liam and his remaining thugs, having recovered from their initial defeat, came crashing back into the clearing. They were arrogant, drawn by the scent of what they thought was a victory. They expected to find a dying man and a prize ready for the taking. They found Hale waiting for them, standing alone in the center of the sacred circle, bathed in the moon's crimson light. He was no longer the desperate, wounded fighter. He was an altar unto himself, a figure of calm, terrible purpose. To Mara, watching from the strange, hazy distance of her near death, the scene was a surreal, disjointed dream. She couldn't hear the snarled threats or feel the chill of the night, but through her bond with Hale, she could feel his intent. The fight that followed was unlike anything she had ever witnessed. Liam lunged, expecting weakness, but Hale met him with a force that was both immense and sorrowful. It wasn't a fight for survival. It was a ritual. With every blow Hale delivered, with every enemy he threw aside, Mara felt a painful, spiritual tearing. He was not just fighting them, he was fighting himself. He was deliberately channeling his own vibrant, powerful wolf soul, the very essence of his being, and offering it up, piece by piece, to the hungry, watching moon. The air in the clearing grew heavy and cold. The red moonlight seemed to intensify, pouring down into Hale as if he were a vessel. Liam, blind to the true nature of the battle, pressed his attack, a cruel smile on his face as he saw Hale begin to weaken. He thought he was winning, but Mara knew the truth. With every grunt of pain, with every stumble, Hale was succeeding. He was unmaking himself. The process was an agony she felt as a distant echo in her own soul. It was the feeling of a spirit being flayed, of a bond between man and beast being violently severed. He was destroying the most sacred part of himself, and he was doing it willingly. For her. The sacrifice reached its peak. Liam, seeing his chance, moved in for the final, killing blow. But Hale was no longer looking at him. His head was tilted back, his face turned up to the blood moon, an expression of pure, heartbreaking release on his features. As Liam's claws sliced through the air, Hale opened his mouth and let out a howl. It was not a sound of rage or defiance. It was a long, mournful, agonizing cry of farewell. It was the sound of a wolf's soul breaking apart, of a wild spirit dissipating into the cold night air. The howl rose, echoed through the forest, and then faded into a profound, shocking silence. As the last note died, the immense power that had filled the clearing vanished. The blood moon faded, returning to a calm, gentle silver. And Hale, his sacrifice complete, collapsed to the ground. In that exact instant, on the altar stone miles away, Mara felt the last of the black, cursed scars on her own skin evaporate into nothing. Her eyes snapped open, the final, ghostly echo of his death howl the first thing she heard in her new, curse-free life. Chapter 21. The Price of Mourning. The world came back into focus with a gasp. The air was clean and cold, smelling of damp earth and pine. The moon above was a serene silver disk in a clearing sky. Mara sat up, her movements stiff but strong. She looked down at her arms, her hands. The skin was clear. The icy fire of the curse was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow ache in the center of her soul. She was alive. She was free. And she was alone. Pushing herself to her feet, she ran, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She followed the echo of his final cry back to the clearing of the fight. Liam and his followers were gone. They had fled, terrified by a magic so far beyond their comprehension of power and dominance. All that remained was the still, silent body of Hale, lying in the center of the stone circle where his wolf had died. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his chest. There was no breath, no heartbeat. He was peaceful, his face relaxed in a way she had never seen before, free from the centuries of pain he had carried. The terrible, beautiful sacrifice was complete. A wave of grief washed over her, so profound it was almost paralyzing. But it was a clean grief, unburdened by rage or despair. He had not been taken from her. He had given himself for her. He had faced the prophecy and rewritten its ending. He had chosen the death of his wolf to grant her life, breaking their eternal, tragic cycle forever. The woman who had once believed love was a prison now understood its truest form. It was freedom. It was a choice, and Hale's choice had been her. Broken-hearted but whole, she gathered his body into her arms. The long walk back to the diner was a silent, solemn funeral procession. She did not hide or shy away from the rising sun. She carried him with a strength she didn't know she possessed, her tears falling silently onto his still face. She took him to the place where their story had begun, the ancient oak tree at the edge of the parking lot. With her own hands, she dug into the soft earth at its roots, a final act of love and farewell. She laid him to rest, the rising sun casting long shadows through the trees. It was over. She was alone, but she was at peace, her own transformation finally complete. As the first golden rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of rose and orange, she placed her palm flat against the freshly turned soil of his grave. A final, tender goodbye. But then she felt it. Beneath her hand, deep in the earth, a faint, rhythmic pulse. It was so soft she at first thought it was the echo of her own heart. She held her breath, pressing down, concentrating. There it was again. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. Faint, impossible, but undeniable. A heartbeat. Chapter 22. The Man Who Came for Breakfast. The days that followed were muted, as if the world had been wrapped in gauze. Mara moved through the motions of her life, brewing coffee, wiping counters, taking orders. But it was all automatic, a ghost haunting her own diner. The memory of the faint heartbeat she'd felt beneath the earth was a flickering ember of impossible hope, a thing so fragile she was afraid to even breathe on it for fear of extinguishing it completely. She was at peace with his sacrifice, but her heart was a hollow, aching space in her chest. He had saved her, but she was left to navigate the silence of a world without him in it. Grieving him was a quiet, constant hum beneath the surface of everything she did. She was refilling the sugar dispensers, the morning sun slanting through the big front window, when the bell over the door chimed. She didn't look up immediately, expecting Gus for his usual black coffee. "Be with you in a minute," she called out, her voice flat. A pair of worn leather boots stepped into her line of sight. They were familiar. Her hands stilled. Slowly, she lifted her head. A man stood there, silhouetted against the bright morning glare. He stepped out of the light, and Mara's breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful thing. It was him. And yet, it wasn't. The fierce, predatory grace of the wolf was gone, replaced by a quiet, grounded stillness. The untamed energy that had always crackled around him had settled into a gentle calm. His hair was the same dark black, but his eyes were no longer the burning, molten gold of a shifter. They were a warm, clear hazel filled with a soft light she had never seen before. It was Hale's face, Hale's body, but the soul looking out at her was different. It was entirely human. A ceramic sugar dispenser slipped from her numb fingers and shattered on the floor. She didn't flinch. She couldn't move. Her mind was a frantic, screaming chaos, unable to reconcile the man she had buried with the man who was standing right in front of her. Hale? The name was a fragile whisper, a question she was terrified to ask. Was she dreaming? Had her grief finally broken her mind? He took a slow step toward the counter, his movements gentle, as if he knew he was approaching a terrified, wounded animal. He didn't speak, just let her look, let her see the impossible truth of him. The curse was gone. The wolf was gone. And in their place, the goddess had granted not an ending, but a new beginning. He had been reborn from the earth, unmade and remade, a man free from the chains of his own blood. Finally, after a silence that seemed to stretch for a lifetime, a small, tentative smile touched his lips. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief, a smile that held all the pain of their shared past and all the hope of an unwritten future. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He stopped at the counter, his warm hazel eyes drinking her in, and spoke, his voice quiet and steady and real. "Guess I finally made it to breakfast." Chapter 23. The Shape of Peace. A month later, the diner was a different place, not because the tables were new or the paint was fresh, but because it was no longer filled with silence. It was filled with laughter. Mara's laughter, a sound she had thought was lost to her forever, now came easily. Hale, now fully accustomed to the strange, wonderful limitations of being human, worked alongside her. They moved in a comfortable, easy rhythm, a silent dance of two people who knew each other's souls. He was no longer a cursed alpha, but a man who found a quiet joy in fixing a wobbly table or learning how to make the perfect omelet. Her fear was gone. The walls she had spent years building had not just been cracked, they had been completely demolished. She no longer shied away from connection. She would touch Hale's arm as she passed, a simple, grounding gesture that was a constant miracle. She would smile at her customers, her eyes bright and open. The woman who had believed that love was a prison had discovered that the right love was the key to the door. Her past was not a life sentence. It was simply a chapter in a story that was now, finally, getting to its happy part. They were rebuilding more than just the splintered front door. They were building a life, one quiet, ordinary day at a time. They talked for hours in the evenings, after the last customer had left, filling in the gaps of their separate, lonely lives. She told him about her family, about the betrayal that had driven her into hiding. He told her about growing up as a draven, the golden prince in a cursed cage, feared and isolated by the very power he wielded. They laid their ghosts to rest together. Her internal world, once a fortress under siege, was now a quiet, open field. She finally understood that the motorcycle crash had not been the beginning of the end of her peaceful life. It had been the chaotic, violent, and beautiful beginning of her real one. The safety she had craved in her isolation was a poor imitation of the profound peace she now felt in his presence. True safety wasn't the absence of danger. It was having someone who would walk into the fire with you. And for you. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, they stood by the front window, watching the last of the light fade. A passing car's headlights swept across the glass, and for a fleeting, magical moment, the reflection merged with the light of the rising moon. It created an image on the window pane, a perfect glowing crescent moon. It was the old pack symbol, but it was different. The sharp, piercing fang of the curse was gone. It was just the moon, whole and serene. A quiet blessing, a sign from the goddess, watching, satisfied, that the debt had been paid and balance had finally been restored. Chapter 24, where the story began. On the night of the first full moon, a night that once would have been a painful, violent transformation for his kind, they walked out into the cool, crisp air. For Hale, it was just a beautiful silver light in the sky, a quiet reminder of all he had given up and all he had gained. They walked to the edge of the parking lot, to the ancient oak tree that bore the scars of their violent meeting. This place, once a symbol of chaos and disruption, had become sacred ground, the beginning of everything. They stood before the tree, its branches a dark lace against the moonlit sky. "I wonder how many times we stood under a moon like this," Hale said, his voice quiet. He slipped his hand into hers, his touch warm and real. "In all the other lives." Mara leaned her head against his shoulder, the peace between them a comfortable, tangible thing. "It doesn't matter anymore," she whispered. "This is the only one that counts. We're the ones who broke the chain." They were not the cursed son and the fated healer anymore. They were just Kyle and Mara, the authors of their own story now. The old marks are gone, he said, gently touching the spot on his arm where the crescent fang had once been. They were about ownership, about destiny. We should have one that's about choice. Taking his hand, Mara led him to the diner and came back with a small bottle of ink and a sterilized needle. It wasn't about pain or permanence, it was about a promise, a ritual of their own making. Under the watchful eye of the full moon and the scarred oak tree, they marked each other. Not with a sigil of a pack or a prophecy, but with a simple, small, unbroken circle on the inside of their wrists. It was a mark of their own design, a symbol of their journey, now come full circle. A promise of a love that was not a repeating tragedy, but an endless, peaceful continuation. It was a mark of their choosing, a bond defined only by them. Their transformation was complete. Two broken souls, haunted by a destiny they had not written, were now whole, redefined by a love they had chosen to fight for. She looked at the simple, perfect circle on her skin, then at the man standing beside her, his hazel eyes full of a quiet, human love. Her heart was full. He didn't just crash in front of my diner that night. He crashed into the walls I built around my heart. And somehow, love made the wreck worth it.